So welcome everyone as we continue with our exciting discussion of biblical interpretation in the Second Temple period. This class, we're going to actually look at what we call interbiblical interpretation, which is interpretation of biblical within biblical books of other biblical books. Now, this type of interpretation, there are two different ways to take this type of interpretation. If you're involved in like biblical criticism in a major way, you will absolutely see this used to talk about, let's say, Deuteronomy is interpreting Leviticus or things like that, right? We're not doing that in this class. What we're really concentrating on is Second Temple, things that we know are from the Second Temple, and what they are doing to interpret works that have already been canonized are considered holy and authoritative. Okay, I mentioned in our last class that part of the whole business of biblical interpretation is to keep holy texts understandable and relevant to new generations. This is already happening in the beginning of the Second Temple period. As soon as you have a Torah that is considered holy and yet unchangeable and also completely relevant, there is biblical interpretation that must be done in order to understand what is going on. So let's dive in. I'm going to dive in with an example that we brought in the last class, but we're going to go a little bit deeper. Okay, so I'm sharing my screen now. Here we are. Okay, we don't need this. And this is what we were talking about last class. We have a verse in Vayikra Chaf Gimel, Leviticus 23, and that we are looking at Leviticus 23, verse 40, Pasuk Mem, right? We're talking about Sukkot. Ulekachtem lachem bayom rishon pri etz hadar kapot tmarim v'anaf etz avot v'avei nachal usmachtem lifnei Adonai el rechem shiv'at yamin. Right. The first day, you should take a fruit of a hadar tree. Right. Is it a citrus tree? Is it specifically the etrog, the citron? Right. Branches of palm trees, other wide leafy branches, willow branches, and you should be happy. You should rejoice before the Lord your God for 7 days. And then right afterwards, it says, you should celebrate this for 7 days. You should dwell in huts, in booths for 7 days. All the citizens, everyone who dwells in Israel should dwell in these huts for 7 days. Okay, so let us go to our early biblical interpretation now. Let's go to Nehemiah, right? So Nehemiah, this is a book that's probably written in its final form. I mean, obviously there are going to be people who date it later, but let's say earliest, maybe end of the 5th, early 4th century BCE. And what we have here is Ezra is reading the Torah, and they discover these holidays that they haven't been keeping. Oh no, we have not been keeping these holidays, but we can do it, right? And they find written in the Torah, and now I'm reading from Nehemiah Chet Yudalad, that's Nehemiah 8:14. Okay. Vayimtzu katuv b'Torah asher tziva Adonai b'yad Moshe asher yeshvu b'nei Yisrael b'Sukkot b'Chag b'Chodesh Levi. They found written in the Torah that God says you're supposed to, in the 7th month, you are supposed to be dwelling in these booths, right? Oh, they better do it, right? B'asher yashmiu v'yaviru kol b'korechem v'Yerushalayim lemor te'u hahar v'aviu alei zayit v'alei et shemen v'alei hadas v'alei tmarim v'alei et avot lasot sukkot kakatuv. So go to the mountains and bring all these leafy branches of all sorts of different kinds. You've got olive trees, pine trees, maybe pine trees, maybe not, myrtles, palms, other leafy trees to make Sukkot, to make the booth as it is written. What are they reading? Let's go back to our verse. They're reading that you're supposed to take all these different branches. Now, today, what do we take? We take the branches and we shake them together, right? But what's written is take the branches and then dwell in Sukkot. So why are you taking the branches? It must be to build Sukkot. So that's what they're saying here. Now, in our last class, I was asked, I couldn't answer right away. So what is the rabbinic interpretation? The rabbinic interpretation is actually pretty straightforward. Okay. The rabbinic interpretation, if here I'm bringing, this is the Gemara, the Babylonian Talmud, right? In Sukkah, Yud Bet Aleph, Sukkah 12a. And what you have here is Rabbi Chisda is bringing proof of what you can use to build the Sukkah with. And he brings proof from this verse in Nehemiah. Why? Because they built Sukkot of that. So clearly it's okay. And they're mainly talking about, he's saying, so what can you use for skach? What can you use for the roof of the Sukkah? Clearly these things that they collected are things that are okay. Any sort of leafy branch, right? Not the fruit itself, but the leafy branch is fine. You can use that, right? And they're bringing the source, because if you're looking at it from a rabbinic perspective and you say, hey, we know that we're supposed to collect these branches and the etrog and shake them, right? And we also have this verse in Nehemiah where they collected branches and they said, as it's written in the Torah, and they collect these branches and they build a sukkah. So we understand that they knew what they were doing. They knew what they were doing. They're just telling us this stuff that they built the sukkah with. So now we know this is all stuff that you can use to build the roof of the sukkah. Okay, so that is a fairly straightforward rabbinic interpretation of both these verses. It doesn't create a tremendous problem rabbinically, and obviously, the way I'm presenting it here is with a certain attitude, saying it really looks to me, not just to me, obviously, this isn't my brilliant idea. It looks like in Nehemiah when they say they collected these branches and built Sukkot from them, as it's written, it seems like they're reading this verse in Vayikra, in Leviticus, and they're reading it to say, why are you gathering these branches? It's to build the sukkah. Okay, so this is what we can talk about as kind of a halachic interpretation that we have very early in the Second Temple period. As soon as you have the Torah, and the Torah is a document to be consulted, they of course have to understand, so what do we need to do? What do we have to do, right? So here's a very similar and also another fairly well-known example that we have in Divrei Hayamim, in Chronicles, also from it's possibly it's hard, let's say it's around the same period, right? Maybe a little later than Nehemiah, but it's not far off. So we're talking about before the kind of gap that we have. Like again, I tend to date things the earliest that they're dated. There are always going to be people who date things later, right? But let's look at this fairly well-known, another case of a holiday, right? Of what do you do on a holiday? Okay. Now in this case, the Hayamim Chronicles is retelling, right? Is retelling kind of the history, right? Going through essentially Samuel and Kings, but starting from the beginning, from Bereshit. But the main part of it is really kind of going over what we have in Samuel and Kings. Now, I do want to say something. Oh, you know what? For right now, let's talk about this halachic interpretation. Later on, I'm going to talk a little bit more about when we can use Chronicles, how the difficulty of saying Chronicles is doing biblical interpretation. We'll talk about that in just a bit. Okay. So, but I'll pause for any questions actually for our last example. Are there any questions? You can put them in the chat. If so, I see there's some stuff in chat. Hold on just a moment. Okay, Moshe Matitya asks, pre-Eitz Hadar can also mean a beautiful fruit. Right, that's how the Samaritans interpret it. They say that various fruits qualify for that, including pomegranates and etrogim. It's conceivable that this was the interpretation in Nehemiah, and that they thought that olive branches with the olives on them qualified. Yeah, that's a very good point. In other words, where are they getting the idea of olive branches, right? So it makes sense that they want a branch that's going to have a little fruit on it, and they're reading it as nice fruit. That makes sense. So thank you. Danny and Louis Barkai ask, why didn't Chazal stick with the interpretation in Nehemiah? Why do we also have a lulav and etrog? Well, first of all, because it says in Vayikra, right? So you have pre-Eitz Hadar. So this is saying the product of idolatries, either beautiful or citrus or something, right? But you would read it as fruit. Now you can't make your sukkah fruit. Now, of course, if you see a Samaritan sukkah, you'll see actually a lot of times I've seen at least a picture where there was tons of fruit like on the coming from the ceiling, right? But the general idea is you're not going to make your sukkah out of fruit. So what are you taking the fruit for, right? And also we do have to remember that there is a lot in rabbinic law that is oral, right? They're like, this is what we always did. This is supposed to be what they did in the sukkah, in the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple, was that they took the arba minim, they took the etrog and the love and all that stuff, and they brought it with them to the temple, right? In other words, this was something that they would do. Now, why aren't they interpreted? So again, there's a real reason not to interpret it as having to do with sukkah, because as soon as you say this is fruit, then you're not going to be building a sukkah with it. And also there is a separation, the full separation of a verse, right? It doesn't say take this stuff and build the sukkah with it. It says take this stuff, and then there's a verse, and then you're going to celebrate. Take this stuff on the first day. This is as you're going to celebrate. For 7 days, you're going to live in a sukkah. So there's real reason to not read it that way. There's a real reason to say these are two separate things, even just looking at the straight text without looking at anything else, right? So there's good reason to kind of read it the other way. And then the verse in Nehemiah again is not a problem, because they say, okay, that's what they built the sukkah from, not a problem. Okay, let's move on to Chronicles. So they are looking at here we are. Okay. So we're talking about in the time of Yoshiyahu, okay, they renew essentially the Passover, the Pesach. All right, so they slaughter the Pesach, and the question is, okay, so now I have to find the exact verse that I wanted to bring, because I've been flipping around a little bit too much. Here we are. Okay. We have an interesting difficulty, right, between when it comes to how do you prepare the Passover sacrifice. And that difficulty is between Shemot, Exodus, and Devarim, Deuteronomy. Okay. So let's take a look at Shmot Yud Bet Chet, that's Exodus 12:8. Okay. V'achlu basar b'layla hazeh tzli esh umatzot amorim yochluhu. And they should eat the meat on that night, roasted in fire, and with matzah, with unleavened bread, on bitter herbs, they should eat it. Okay, great. But then in Devarim, in Deuteronomy, Devarim Tet Zion, Deuteronomy 16:7. It says, "Ubishalta v'achalta b'makom asher yivchar Adonai Elohecha bo, ufanita baboker v'alechta lo alecha." And you should, because here it's talking about the importance of doing this in the Beit HaMikdash, or near the Beit HaMikdash, at least in the area of the Beit HaMikdash, of the temple. You should cook it and eat it in the place that God chooses. And then in the morning, you should go home. So what's the problem? The problem is there's roasting and there's cooking. Roasting is one thing and cooking is something else. Now, honestly, probably what's going on here is that the cooking here is being used in a more general sense. It's not necessarily saying don't roast it. It's just using the word to cook in a general sense. But bishalta usually means to boil, right? So here you have roasting on fire, specifically don't boil. That's in Exodus, specifically roasted on fire, tzli. And then in Deuteronomy, it's using the word for cooking, which is normally to boil. And you should boil it. Okay, so what are you going to do? So here we go to Chronicles. They're talking about this tremendous Passover Pesach service that was done under Yoshiyahu, under Josiah. And they say, what did they do? Vayivashlu ha-Pesach ba'esh kamishpat v'kodoshim bishlu basirot ubadvadim ubatalechot bayaritzu l'chol bnei ha'am. So they cooked the Pesach in fire according to the law. This is an interesting case because it absolutely seems, now whenever one of these books says, as it is written, as in the law, that means there's some kind of, they're actually looking at something and checking, right? So what's going on here, okay, what's going on here is they said, okay, in one place it says livashel, another place it says to cook or boil, another place it says sli eight, roasted in fire. So we're going to give you the interpretation, they cooked it in fire. In other words, we will tell you that when it says livashel, to cook / boil, they meant to cook it in fire. And so we're going to use both words here in the same verse to say they did it according to the law. This is what the law meant. Pause for questions, because I see they are coming in. Okay, so there's no questions on this. There's Moshe shows, if anyone wants to look at the chat, Moshe has shared a Samaritan sukkah, Shomroni sukkah, with lots of fruits on the ceiling, and an etrog in the middle. Very nice. So if we go back to this verse, what's going on is it's actually going word by word, and it's taking a word from one place and a word from another, combining it and saying, this is the law. This is what's meant to be. All right. So here we have an interesting case of halakhic interpretation, which is much more exact than what we saw in Nehemiah, where it's actually trying to say, we know these two verses, and they do work together, right? So those are a couple examples of halakhic interpretation. And now I would like to move on. I'm going to pause for questions in case anyone has any questions. Please put them in the chat. Okay, questions or comments, and then I'm going to move on to a more narrative, some more narrative interpretation that we find, in particular in Chronicles, in Divrei Hayamim. Okay, don't see any questions coming in yet, so I'm going to move on.
And just one question here.
Sure.
Yeah, one question regarding the boiling and roasting. Doesn't the first source, like Shmo, talk about Yetziat Mitzrayim, what they do on that specific evening, and Dvarim on the general?
Yes. And yet, it's very clear the Divrei Hayamim that Chronicles wants to make them both work together. Okay, so what's interesting is that what you're saying is something that rabbinically they don't say. Rabbinically, they say no, it must be roasted in fire, right? That is, so like what you're saying is an out. Like rabbinically, they could have said no, normally they boil it, but just in the first one they roast it. It's not what rabbinically you say. Rabbinically, you say it has to be roasted. It's got to be roasted, right? And what's interesting is that if we look at, again, at Chronicles, it's very, at Divrei Hayamim, it's very important, note that they're using in fire. It's very important to them to note that it is in fact roasted in fire. All right, cooked in fire as per the law. Now, what's very possible here is that in fact that's what they were doing. They were roasting it, and so they needed to. So coming from a place where we're roasting it, and we have these two verses. So how do we reconcile with them? Well, we're going to say livashel, to cook, means to roast. And we will say it clearly in this verse that this is the way you legally do what you need to do. Kamishpat, as according to the law. Okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
The second half of the pasuk where it talks about Bishul B'Sirot.
Yes.
That's not trying to.
It could be. It could be. It could be. I was thinking of mentioning that as well. In other words, it's saying, and in case we didn't cover cooking enough, they cooked other stuff, because there's clearly boiling, right? Because they're cooking it in pots, right? So the second part of the verse, they're actually taking, and there are other offerings that they cooked, that they boiled in pots, right? And maybe that's another way of reconciling, right? But I do think that it's the first half of the verse is doing the heavy lifting here. By using the word livashel together with fire, they're specifically saying the word livashel, cooking, boiling, actually here means roasting. Right?
I had a question that pops back a little bit, if I may.
Sure.
So classic Masorah is that Torah Shebaal Peh had a chain going back to Moshe Rabbeinu.
Yeah.
Now, if recorded in Nehemiah, the community managed to forget an entire holiday.
Yeah.
How
That's
do
not
we?
the only time we forget a holiday. We forget Pesach all the time, right?
Right.
We can't blame us. Like,
I mean, how do we reconcile that there was that an all Masorah was actually maintained?
well, I mean, if you're going to look in terms of the rabbinic Masorah, they say the Masorah is going through Ezra. So from their point of view, Ezra is maintaining the Masorah. It's just regular people forgot, right? Ezra's reading the Torah, and everyone's like, "Oh my God, we didn't keep Rosh Hashanah," right? And they all get really upset, right? But you can still say that the Masorah is maintained through Ezra himself, right, as a person, right?
Okay, so this
All
was
you
really a matter of the
need-
people being in a classroom, the people hearing the public reading and learning about something that Ezra always knew about, but they had forgotten.
That would be the way to talk about it in terms of Masorah. In other words, if you're talking about keeping a line of Masorah, that is the way to address it, right? And that is why, I mean, it's not like we're reading verses that no one's read before, right? How did Chazal, how did the rabbis look at these verses? They said, well, everyone forgot, but there were people keeping the Masorah, right? That's clearly, that's what they describe. They describe it going from one person to the next person, right, until it spreads out a little bit. So that's but it really happens. It's kind of crazy the extent to which this seems to happen, right? That people don't know what they're supposed to be doing and have no clue, and then someone reads something to them and they're like, "Oh my God, there's all these laws I didn't know about." Right? So it happens. This isn't, it happens with Yoshiao. It happens. So this is not unusual. And in fact, these examples of interpretation are specifically coming when they're kind of renewing these practices. So here, okay, so now let me, I'll share my screen again. Wait, are there any more questions before I move on? Okay. Here we go. Okay. So here, we're going to move on to, this is another example that I mentioned last time, but we didn't see it inside, as it were. We didn't see it in the verses. Okay, this is at the kind of end of the Davidic story, right? We're kind of talking about, kind of looking back at his reign, and we have this interesting passage I'm reading now. It's 2 Samuel 24, verse 1, which is Shmuel Bet Chaf Dalet Aleph. Okay. Vayosef af Adonai lacharot b'Yisrael vayaset et David bahem lemor lech minei et Yisrael vet Yehuda. Right. So God continued to be angry at Israel, and he incited David against them by telling David, "Go count Israel and Yehuda." So God somehow misled King David and got him to count Israel. And what happens is David does ask for that count, right? And Yoav, the perpetual kind of fly in his ointment, is like, "Why do you want to do this? This doesn't make sense. Why do you want to do this?" But he's like, "No, we're going to do this." And then what happens is they do in fact do this, and and then David realizes he did something wrong, right? So I'm reading now Pasuk Yud, verse 10. Vayachlev David oto achrechen safar ta'am. Right? And he reproached himself, he regretted very badly counting the people, which is interesting because like everyone knows apparently that it's bad to count them. Yoav was like, "Why do you want to do this?" And then he realized he did something bad, right? And he goes and he says to God, "Chatati ma'od asher asiti," right? "I have sinned badly in what I did. Please remove the sin of your servant, the guilt of your servant, because I've acted foolishly." And then God's like, "Well, I'll give you a choice of 3 things." And essentially he chooses a plague that has devastating results. Okay. This is a really, you kind of really feel crappy about this whole thing. Like, okay, so David made a mistake, but it starts off saying that God almost tricked him. And what it seems to be saying is God was angry at Israel. And therefore, because God was angry at Israel, God kind of allowed David to think, he kind of encouraged him behind the scenes to think in this way, to do this bad thing that would end up in this tremendous punishment. Devarim Yamim Chronicles is retelling this. It's retelling this story. This is another example of that rewritten Bible that I've mentioned before, where it's retelling the biblical story in a way that fixes problem. Vayamot Satan al Yisrael, vayaset et David limnot Yisrael. And an adversary, remember, Satan here does not necessarily mean the satanic figure that we all are so familiar with. It could be that. It could be any sort of, I mean, it clearly seems to be not a spiritual adversary, right? Whoops, hold on. A spiritual adversary, right? Again, so here we're absolutely talking about a spiritual, it seems to be a spiritual adversary, right? An unnamed adversary, but it's not necessarily the Satan that we're used to, right? Because at this point, this idea of Satan is not super firm. So Vayamot Satan Yisrael, an adversary stood against Israel and incited and kind of tricked David to count Israel, right? And then afterwards, we have a similar story. Yoav objects. He's like, why are you doing this? But he still does it. And then God's unhappy at him. He doesn't understand on his own that how bad he was. God is upset at him and he smites Israel. And then David kind of repents. Okay. Actually, let me make sure that this is not, yeah, so in note that in the original, right, in Samuel, nothing happens to cause David to reproach himself. He apparently should have known from the beginning that this was a bad thing, which is why in the book of Samuel, it can say kind of God caused him to do it. What does that mean? It's kind of like hardening Pharaoh's heart. Like David is doing something bad, right? And God kind of didn't let him be stubborn and do it. Whereas in Devarim Yamim Chronicles, it's not super clear, but we know that a Satan caused him to do it. And then once Israel starts being hit, David realizes he did something bad, okay? So this is a classic example of, and we had this when we were looking in our introduction, when we looked at how Jubilees changed a verse where into a satanic figure doing it rather than God doing it. Here we have the exact same thing, much earlier than Jubilees, much earlier than Jubilees, where it's a simple switcheroo. Instead of God, it's Satan. Instead of God, it's a Satan, right? And we ask the same question. Well, haven't people read the earlier book? And the answer is yes, but this is supposed to fix that. You're supposed to kind of read this and kind of say, oh, I guess this is the right thing. It's trying to fix this problem. Okay. Now, I do want to say also, this is when we start getting this idea of the Second Temple period is when we start getting this idea of satanic figures, of like a big satanic figure that does stuff, right? So it depends on how you date the frame of Eov, of Job, and you guys have heard me say this before, that I think that the core of Eov, the poetic stuff, and that's most of the book, we can date that early or lately, or there are different arguments going both ways, but I think it's pretty clear that the prose frame of Job seems to be Second Temple, and that's where you have the satanic figure kind of playing this big part in what's going on. And here we have a similar situation where we can kind of blame bad things on a satanic figure. And remember, and as we're going to talk about it later in this course, of course, one of the things that you need in order to be able to blame things on a chief satanic figure is for that satanic figure to nevertheless be completely subservient to God. Like it can't be anywhere near God's level. But you can have this figure that you can kind of blame things on. And that does become a feature of biblical interpretation when you want to fix stuff, right? You can blame the satanic character. Any questions or comments? I don't see any. Okay, continuing on.
But just
Yes.
a footnote.
Sure.
Did you happen to hear Benny Lau's drasha at Yedidia just a little bit after Pesach?
No, I think I missed it. What was it about?
Because this was sort of his Dvar Torah of the year, because he repeated on the radio and about this commentary on what appears in the Haggadah, which is the quote from Divrei Hayamim of Dronetu Yaz Hadever. How what exactly was the sin of David in counting the people?
Yeah. I mean,
about treating the people as numbers as numbers rather than as individuals.
Right.
And
it's interesting to say, like, what is it supposed to be? And I think it's interesting if we look at I'll share my screen once again if we're already going to be talking about this. Okay, so I'm looking now in Shmuel, and we see in Shmuel the first time we have this kind of being told. What Yoav said, what his objection is, and this is kind of repeated in Devarim and Chronicles. Vayomer Yoav el HaMelech v'Yosef Adonai Elohecha el ha'am kahem v'chahem mea pamim v'nei Adonai HaMelech ro'ot v'Adonai HaMelech lama chafetz b'davar hazeh. Yoav answered the king, may the Lord God increase the number of the people 100-fold. I wouldn't say 100-fold, but like numerous times. Yeah, I guess 100-fold. 100-fold. While your own eyes see it, I should say, and your own eyes will see it. But why does my Lord King want this? And in Divrei Yamim, it's a little bit different. It says, Kulam la'adoni la'avadim. They're all your servants. What do you care how many there are? Right? So in Shmuel, what it seems to be saying is, you don't need to count them. God will make sure there are plenty. What is your purpose here in counting them? And in Chronicles and Divrei Yamim, it seems to be, you must be counting them in order to somehow increase your lordship over them. Or if you think that they're going to betray you, why are you counting them? They're all your servants, right? There seems to be he's implying that maybe you think some of them are going to rebel. Why are you counting them, right? So it's interesting, these different kind of tones that we have there. It's pretty much usually not what we come up with when, I guess you could, in the Shmuel, you can absolutely stretch it to say, the idea is that you shouldn't be, what does it matter? Why count? Like, that is the thing, why count, right? What does it matter how many there are? What does that matter? And I think part of it is, what is the purpose of a king? But then why would Israel be punished? That's the problem. Like, you say, why does a king want to do a census? For no good reason. If I'm a regular person and all of a sudden the king's like, you know what, I'm going to count you. You're like, what? All of a sudden you count? What are you planning, right? What are you counting us for? But then why would the nation be punished? That's the strange thing. And it seems to imply in Shmuel and Samuel that the idea is you don't kind of trust that you're going to have enough people, and you should be trusting in God. God will increase the people. Just leave it alone, right? This is a God thing. This is not a you thing, right? So maybe that could be it. But I'm not saying, I mean, I've heard really great, things. I like to think that we're not just numbers, and I do think you can see that in the text. It's just, there's the one where if you count people, then the blessing, you're limiting the blessing. People, you have to leave space for unlimited blessing, and so you don't count people. That's what I grew up with. You don't count people, you just say a pasuk, you say a verse as you go through them. But let's move on to our next source. Okay.
I just that again.
No, we have to move on. I don't want to, I don't want to keep people. Yeah.
So maybe okay. I'll mention this at the end.
Okay. Cool. Okay, let's go. Here we go. Okay. So here is another example of kind of an expansion that comes from a theological place. Whereas our previous example was, how could you say God is doing this? It must be a Satan who's doing it. Well, that's the bottom line. How can you say God is doing it? It must be a Satan who's doing it. You can't say God is doing it. And that was the basis of kind of the fix. Here we have something else. Here we have the death of Yoshiyahu of Josiah. Now, he is generally accepted to be a tremendously righteous king. Okay, so why does he die young? All right, so let's take a look and we have different explanations. So if we look in Melachim Bet in 2 Kings, Melachim Bet Chaf Gimel, 2 Kings 23, it's talking about how great Yoshiyahu is. And it says, and I'm going to do, and in verse 27 in Pasuk, no, not 27, 26, Pasuk Chavav, we have kind of a little insertion that despite his righteousness, lo shav Adonai mecharon apo hagadol asher chara apo bihuda al kol hakasim asher hichitzon minashteh. All right. So he says, but God did not reverse his anger, that he was angry to Judah for everything that Menashe had done. Okay. Menashe, before Yoshiyahu, had done bad things. He had idol worship, etc., etc. And God has not forgiven the people for what they have done under Menashe. Right? Vayomer Adonai gam et Yehuda asir me'al panai kasher hasiroti et Yisrael umasti et ha'ir hazot asher bachati et Yerushalayim v'et habayit asher amati yesh misham. And God says, and therefore I'm going to destroy Jerusalem. What is this explaining? This is explaining despite the fact that Yoshiyahu is so righteous, his righteousness and his righteous rule does not prevent the eventual destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Okay, and it blames that on Menashe, who came before him. All right. And it says, okay, the other events of his reign are recorded. And then, so how does he die? It just says very simply, B'yamav ala paro necho melech Mitzrayim al melech Ashur al nahar Prat, v'yelech hamelech Yoshiyahu l'krato v'yimitel b'gido kirototo. So Paro Necho, king of Egypt, he was marching against the king of Assyria on the Euphrates, and Yoshiyahu, who was part of an alliance against him, marched against him, and he killed him at Megiddo when he saw him. All right, and it explains that they took his body and buried it in Jerusalem. Okay, that's it. That's it. He went into battle and died in battle. That is the explanation of why he died. Okay, now you can see that for Chronicles, that is not enough. That doesn't explain it. You have a really righteous king who does great stuff, who renews the worship of God according to the Torah, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Why does he die young? Why does he die in battle as opposed to of old age on his bed? Right? That doesn't seem to be fair. That doesn't seem to be right. Right? He refurbishes the temple. He does all these wonderful things. So what happens in Chronicles? We have Vayishlach Elav Malachim Lemor. Okay. Oh, here I'm going to start. Sorry, I'm reading now from 2 Chronicles 35:20. That's Divrei Hayamim Bet Lamed Hey Chaf. Achrei Kol Zot Asher Yechin Yoshiyahu Et Habayit Ala Necho Melech Mitzrayim Lilachem Bechar Kamish Al Prat Ve'etzei L'Krato Yoshiyahu. So after all this, after Yoshiyahu refurbished the temple, Necho, the king of Egypt, comes to fight in Harkamish on the Euphrates, and Yoshiyahu, Josiah, goes to meet him. Vayishlach elav malachim lemor, ma balach melch Yehuda, lo alecha tayom, ki el bet milchamti, ve'Elohim amar levahaleni, hadalecha me'Elohim asher imi v'al yafitecha. So Necho said, what do you have against me, king of Yehuda? I'm not marching against you this day. I'm marching against a royal house that is warring with me, a royal house that is involved in this war with me, not you. And God said that I should hurry. And he's using it's done well because he doesn't know the Judahite name for God, right? He's not going to say Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. He's going to use a general word for God. He's like, God said that I should hurry. So don't interfere with God, who's with me, and then he won't destroy you. ולא הסב יאשיהו פניו ממנו, כי להילחם בו התחפש, ולא שמע על דברי נחום מפי אלוהים, ויבוא להילחם בבג"ד. Yoshiao didn't listen. He didn't hear Necho's words that came eventually from the mouth of God, and he went to fight him in Megiddo, and so he dies, right? And this is giving an extra explanation, right? Why did Yoshiyahu die even though he was so righteous, right? He died despite his tremendous righteousness because he did not listen to the word of God as conveyed to him through the Pharaoh who didn't have an argument with him. And instead he went to battle. He didn't listen and turn back when he should have. And therefore, he didn't listen to the word of God, and so he fell in battle. So this is giving an explanation of how could it be that he fell in battle? How does that even make sense? And the answer is because in the fact that he went out to battle in itself was actually against the word of God, and so he fell. Now you could say, well, how is he supposed to know? Any king could say, hey, I'm listening to your God, right? And that's not but that's not the author's problem. The author is what they call the chronicler. That's not the chronicler's problem. His problem is not to say, well, what could he have done? His problem is to say, how could it be that such a righteous king, one of the most righteous kings, died B'Terem Eit before he should have, right? And how did he die at the hand of a foreign king, not just at home of old age? Why did that happen? What's interesting is that we already have a different type of explanation that has to be undertaken in Shmuel Ben in 2 Samuel, where it says, how could it be that after such a righteous king, Jerusalem was not saved? And then we have to go back a generation and say, well, it was because of Menashe, because Menashe was so terrible. Yes.
Miriam, all this is happening after Mamlechet Israel is gone?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, sorry.
Yes, there's no more. That's it for Israel, for northern Israel, I should say. Right. So this is when it's just Yehuda, and it's. But what I wanted to say though about Divrei about Chronicles is that there we have an interesting case because we can tell, right, that the chronicler was drawing not only from the book of Samuel, from Shmuel, right? He was also drawing from other documents that he had access to. Okay. I'm going to say he because I think it's pretty clear he's a guy, he's a man. I don't mean to be offensive. The chronicler actually seems to have access to other texts that he's using also to fill in certain gaps. So sometimes when we see something added, it's not necessarily an interpretation. He's not necessarily limited only to the book of Samuel as his historical source, right? He has some other sources that he'll sometimes draw from. Okay. Now, of course, it's also true and it's interesting because, like, for those of you who are with me in the class in Ezra and Nehemiah, there's a lot going on in Nehemiah where he's not interpreting the Bible, where he doesn't feel he needs to interpret the Bible. So, for example, when he says that merchants are not allowed to sell their wares on Shabbat, obviously, because you can't work on Shabbat, right? That is obvious without any specific type of interpretation, right? Shabbat is a day of rest. You are not supposed to work. You cannot sell your wares or buy wares on Shabbat. Whereas what's interesting is that later on, when we have the framework that the rabbis place on the laws of Shabbat, where everything has to fit, almost everything has to fit into this idea of creative acts, that a creative act is what is not allowed on Shabbat, they get into a problem because buying and selling is not a creative act per se. And that's why we have to have the thing, well, you would write it down, right? But Nehemiah doesn't have to say you write it down. Nehemiah is like, it's pretty darn clear that you can't buy and sell on Shabbat, right? Everyone knows this, right? And I'm telling you that if you try and do it in my Jerusalem, you're going to get in trouble, right? So that's a case where we actually have, and if going to what Joel was saying later, if you want to talk about the Masorah, there you have a very nice, clear case of from my point of view, of a Masorah. Like, he's not saying, oh, I'm interpreting this verse. He's like, everyone knows this. Guys, everyone knows. You can't buy or sell on Shabbat. You try and do it. I'm not going to be happy, and I know how to make you very, very unhappy, right? So that's an interesting contrast where we don't always need to have this situation where they're citing verses, right? There's a lot of things where they're like, well, but everyone, this is what you have to do, or everyone knows this. Not everything that's written is biblical interpretation, right? Not everything that they're doing is necessarily pointing to a specific verse. Now, obviously, once we get to the Second Temple period, people are thinking more in terms of probably legal law books, looking at something and pointing to it and saying this is law. When we in the ancient Near East earlier, if we're talking about the Bible itself, right? And again, this connects to the idea of Masorah. If you look at Code of Hammurabi or any of these ancient Near Eastern texts, they're generally not meant to be actual law books. They're actually usually probably based on court transcripts, case transcripts themselves. And judges would actually judge according to a basic idea of the legal traditions, as opposed to looking at a law book and pointing to something. And so you have this case of, for example, the Code of Hammurabi, where it's writing principles, or it's writing things kind of based on case law, or case law that's from judicial traditions. So that is, in fact, the way law worked in the ancient Near East, was oral traditions of this is what the law is. This is how you need to adjudicate. That's just an aside for an earlier period of legal practice. Any questions or comments for my final words? I do not see anyone putting anything in the chat. This is a quiet group. Is everything clear? I hope so.
Miriam?
Yes.
It seems like you're talking that, with the exile and then the return, that there's a really big break in tradition, and that people have lost what to do. Is that making sense? And I think this is another, it's what the destruction of Jerusalem brought, is just this enormous break. And Ezra and Nehemiah feel they have to pick it all up again. That's what we talk about.
It's a break and a development. I'm getting an echo, so I apologize to everyone. So anyone who's still got their is unmuted, please mute yourselves. So my apologies, and then I'll stop, and then you can talk again. What was I going to say? Yeah, so there are different things happening, right? So certainly if you look at someone like Jonathan Adler in his latest book, where he says there was pretty much no one was keeping Torah until the Hasmoneans, which I think is, I don't know how he explains Ben Sira, but I haven't read his book. So I was like, there's first of all, there's a break. And second, there had to be a real shift once you have, and I've talked about this before, once you have the exile, because the way you're keeping anything and the way you look at everything when they're in the land and you're a nation in the land, and once you're out of the land, who the heck knows where you are or what nation? Israel, they go, and then either they come back and they're part of the nation, or they're not, right? So there's this idea that, okay, a lot of them managed to make it back south and make it back, kind of rejoin the Israelite people, the Judite people, but the ones who didn't, what is their status? And it's as long as you're a nation in the land, and that's what everything's built around. All your holidays are built around the land, and all your practices are built around the land, and a lot of your beliefs and history are built around the land. And then you're exiled from the land. Okay, so now again, I know that that thing of the myth of the empty land. Not everyone was exiled. There were people who managed to stay, but many people were exiled. And a lot of the ones who kept writing it, were exiled, were in exile. So you have to kind of recreate something, and then you come back, and now what, right? So it's you have a lot of these natural breaks and traditions. How are you keeping Passover? Now we think of Passover because we're so used to the exile, right? We think of Passover as not eating bread for 7 days, but Pesach, the first day is not Passover, is not the Chag HaMatzot, is not the holiday of Matzot. It's Pesach, it's Passover, which is 1 day, which is the sacrifice. Now, how are they doing that sacrifice? They can't possibly be doing that sacrifice. They're not at the temple. There's no temple, right? So they come back. They have to do it at the temple. What are they doing, right? It's been a while, right? So there are all these practices that are so built around being an agricultural society in the land of Israel that once you break that and then you come back, you're naturally going to have to renew a lot of things and figure out a lot of stuff. Pesach, especially if you're talking about the sacrifice, right? So anything that's temple bound, you absolutely have to be like, okay, what are we doing? And then the question is, how does practice actually differ, right? So, with mikvot, were they using mikvot in the first temple period the way they were in the second temple? Mikvot as ritual baths. All these questions in terms of what were they doing and how common was it? That's the other question. How common was it? Because there's this argument a lot of times, archaeologists will say, oh, people weren't keeping things in the first temple. I'd be like, well, you read the Torah and you read Tanakh and people weren't keeping things, right? People were not keeping things. Were people worshiping idols? You bet they were worshiping idols. Yeah, it says they were worshiping idols. So that's also something where there absolutely is, once you get to the second temple period, much more of an idea of we worship our God, we keep our rules, as opposed to, well, we're in Israel, so if we need rain, why not sacrifice to Baal? That sort of idea is gone by the second temple period, right? That's not an acceptable idea by anyone, it seems. It doesn't seem to be a real argument anywhere. It's not a real danger. Even towards the end of the first temple period, right? Jeremiah can laugh at idol worshipers in a way that feels like no one's really doing it, at least in this this nation, right? He can say, "Oh, ha ha ha!" Look at what they're doing. They use he can laugh at idol worshipers in a way, and the concept of idol worship that implies that it's not a real threat. No one's really believing in these things right at that point. So that's also, in terms of what it means to be and at this point we call them Jews, right? In terms of Israelites, right? What that means. What does that mean to be a Jew once you've been in exile and kept your identity, and then you came back? So what does that mean? Because it used to mean, for the exile, it used to mean being an Israelite in your land, right? That's what it meant. You were in your land, you were an Israelite in your land, this is your family, this is your people, this is your town, this is your land, right? And this is your God, right? And then you're exiled, and they kept it. And already when they were exiled, it had to change to something else. It had to change to something that wasn't obvious. I was talking with a friend of mine who works in the Jewish agency. I know, guys, I'm over time, but this actually connects. She was talking about how in Israel, there's such a thing as passive Judaism that doesn't exist anywhere else. And she was talking to an Israeli, a secular Israeli she knew, and he said, "What are you talking about? I don't know what you're talking. What do you mean?" And she said, "Look, do you know what Shavuot is?" And he says, "Sure." She said, "What do you do on Shavuot?" He's like, "I don't do anything. There's no reason to do anything. Whatever, watch television. I don't know. It's a day off." And she's like, "Does your kid know what Shavuot is?" And he's like, "Well, yeah." It's like, because you don't have to do anything to your kid, because your kid lives in Israel. So they know what Shavuot is. They might not keep anything. They might not do anything. She said, "Do you know what Tisha B'Av is?" And he said, "Well, sure, I know what Tisha B'Av is." She says, "In America, Tisha B'Av is in the summer. So even if a kid is going to Hebrew school, a lot of kids don't know right? Because it's in the summer, they're not in school. And there's a passive Judaism that you can have in Israel, right? And that was in the first temple period, you can have this kind of, hey, I'm here, I know the God we worship, I know what we're supposed to do it, not do it. I know that there's certain things that are part of your culture in a way that has to be a conscious decision once you're exiled. And we made that conscious decision. That decision was made. But then you return to the land, and what certain practices are come back. And things have changed. I've talked before about Yechezkel and the whole different way in which they're seeing consequences and the consequences for the individual, and how that has shifted since everyone was in the same place sharing the faith. Anyway, so I think you guys have gotten a little bit a little taste of just how many things it opens when we look at biblical interpretation in this period, and how many ideas, theological issues, interpretive issues, and we will continue looking at these fascinating areas and what we can learn about people and worldviews and how they change, and the desire to keep the Torah relevant and meaningful through the kind of very strange period of the Second Temple period. And we'll keep looking at that in our next class. So I look forward to seeing you then.